Dwarf Fortress is an incredibly unique game, developed by Bay 12 Games with an extended development history spanning over 20 years at the time of writing this. Dwarf Fortress is lauded as an exemplary creative outlet with seemingly infinite possibilities to express oneself. Free from all the complications and constraints of modern-day gaming, Dwarf Fortress feels like a breath of fresh air to play. However, that does not free itself from its own brand of frustrations. Dwarf Fortress features amazing moments that make you feel like a genius, as well as plenty other moments that make you question why you're even spending the time. We'll get into some of the complaints later. For now, I need to preface this video by saying that there are two distinct eras of Dwarf Fortress. There's a Steam edition that was released on December 6th of 2022 that features a different graphical style and interface than the previous edition. And prior to that was the ASCII graphics version. I've only played the Steam edition for a long period of time, and I personally feel like new players will prefer the Steam edition. So I'm only going to talk about that version. Plus, it makes for an easier to watch video. When you begin your adventure through the default options, you allow the game to generate years and years of history for your world, while also generating the actual landscape and terrain you will be playing and simulating in. The first big gameplay decision you make is selecting where to embark. Embarking is choosing a plot of wilderness in which your dwarves will settle down and begin making their new home. Things to look for while embarking include mountains, rivers, trees, soil variety, and honestly what I feel is most important, if there's any aquifers around that area. Aquifers, in the context of Dwarf Fortress, refer to subterranean deposits of water that limit where you can dig and build underground. Aquifers can either be the most frustrating part of the game to deal with, or could provide a great way for a creative person to incorporate the natural elements into their fortress, Frank Lloyd Wright style, depending on how you choose to play the game. Watching people who are far more intelligent and creative work with water and aquifers in Dwarf Fortress is like watching a magician. And even after the 50 or so hours I've played, I'm still scratching the surface of manipulating water. After embarking, the game gives you 7 dwarves and a cart full of supplies. The team is usually well-rounded, although you can customize your initial squad if you decide you'd like to specialize in the early game. It can get pretty detailed if you want to spend the time to craft the exact beginning you want. I will give Bay 12 Games credit. They really make you feel in control of your starting situation, which is very nice. The game provides a tutorial on how to move the camera and start with basic crafting and mining, and that's honestly about it. There's a help section that provides a few other details on the systems that'll keep your fortress surviving, or through sheer force of will thriving, but I find these vague at best. I'd like to speak on this issue later, so instead, as you progress in Dwarf Fortress, you begin taking in new settlers that want to join your settlement, whether you like it or not. It's very important you learn the skills of your dwarves, as while you can start with unskilled dwarf on, for example, like mining. In the early game, looking for a dwarf who is already skilled at mining dramatically increases how fast you can get your dwarves to safety and with a roof, or in this case, a mountain, over their heads. There's other skills too, such as planters, metalsmiths, and craft makers. Later in the game, I find it isn't really too necessary to pay attention to the skills, because you'll have the population to do most tasks quickly, but early game, it's pretty much mandatory. While you await settlers, you first must get systems in place to create food and drinks, most likely alcohol. Unsurprisingly, having neither of these is a pretty immediate fortress killer. Here you will begin to see players choosing their paths with how they will run their fortress. For me, I always end up playing Dwarf Fortress as if I'm playing Factorio. Inputs and outputs, baby. Automation is king. Usually I try to get one dwarf in the early game for each of these. Mostly a fisherman who catches and prepares fish to store, and a planter who farms things like plump helmets, which can be brewed into drinks infinitely as the dwarf saves and replants the seeds. These 2 dwarves I will try to never put on any other tasks until inevitably they get their arms cut off by a goblin, or fall down a ravine, or drowned in one of the previously mentioned aquifers. That pretty much sums up the early game. There are other things to worry about, as well as like trading for goods you can't produce yourself yet, building bedrooms, as well as offices for your dwarves in command. But if you could get past the previously mentioned hurdles, then you're probably going to figure these out. Now, I want to get into why I wanted to make this video. I'm going to say it plain and simple. Dwarf Fortress has one of the steepest barriers to entry of almost any game I've ever played. I'm talking standing on the apex of your mountain fortress and looking down level of steepness. This is doubly true for the ASCII version of the game. I find it funny how many times I'm at work and get a huge hankering to start a new fortress or continue an old one, dreaming of all the goofy dwarves and the ruckus that they're going to get up to, or designing in my head a grand mountain palace with a giant throne room, grand taverns with the best alcohol a dwarf can drink, all while being stalwartly defended by well-placed traps and trained military dwarves. Only to open up the game and be stopped dead in my tracks by something as simple as just trying to secure food and drinking water. In Dwarf Fortress, it's not as simple as, hey you, go plant and harvest food, because you're not in direct control of the dwarves. Long story short, you can only offer suggestions to them and their leaders. Meaning if you are begging for the dwarves to please remove the corpse from your main entranceway because the miasma it emits is causing everyone's happiness to tank, they can, and most likely will, choose instead to do anything else and stay pissy about their buddy's corpse laying on the floor. This leads to a lot of frustration and Googling to figure out what and how you can further incline your dwarves to do what you want them to do. Which leads me to my next point. This game must be played with a guide. The tutorial text dumps are almost useless. I understand that Dwarf Fortress is meant to be a sim game, and the devs want you to learn through trial and error. I get that, but something even as simple as combat can turn your play session into a 2-hour Googling and YouTubing session instead, especially if games like this don't come natural to you. I find a lot of the magic of the game gets lost when you've had 2 fortresses crumble because of dehydration. So, out of desperation, you Google how to make a good system for hydration and what things to farm to make alcohol, and don't even get me started on how to make a well. Only to find out about something like, for example, plump helmets. Remember what I mentioned about plump helmets earlier? How they can be set to be made into drinks only, thereby saving the seeds which will be planted again and then harvested into more drinks in an endless cycle? Well, I found that out through a Reddit post. Dwarf Fortress outsources knowledge and tutorials like that to the community, which I suppose can be seen as a way to develop a circle of fans or whatever, but it doesn't feel like that. Instead, it makes me feel like experimentation isn't really encouraged. Do I set up the tried and true plump helmet drink system, or do I instead try to experiment something different and risk losing the population and possibly a few hours of gaming? I'll bring this up again in a later video if I ever make one about Dark Souls 3, but games that require you to have a tab open to Google in order to understand what's going on or to know how to do basic gameplay features really tarnish their own merit. To me, games like this should strive to have a robust tutorial system, especially with 20 years of development. One area that could use a robust tutorial system is the combat. I'm going to come right out and say it, the combat in Dwarf Fortress is genuinely bad and unintuitive. Like, watch this combat encounter and try to see if you understand anything about it. Combat in Dwarf Fortress, I personally feel, should have a unique tutorial scenario separate from any fortress you make. I believe it should have a small, pre-built fortress and heavily scripted enemy encounters as the game stops and explains different mechanics of combat as they play out. Things like armor type, weapon type, traps, and how to build and set them up. There's stuff like giant axe blades and enormous corkscrews that I fully believe if you tried to play blind, the average person wouldn't even know where to start with stuff like that, and let alone successfully create functioning traps. Does that sound like handholding? No, not really. I find a lot of tryhards let themselves be blinded by pride and think others should quote-unquote get good just because that's how they prefer it. My friend, I'm a grown adult with a busy life. I don't think a proper tutorial on complex systems is too much to ask. You can even keep it open-ended and vague, but at least show me once how to do things. Last complaint I have is with the graphics, and while I can hear all the old-timers booing, I think in our year 2024 it's a valid concern. The pixel art is great. The colors feel great to rest my eyes on. None of that's an issue. To me, the static nature of the movements, the way sprites can stack and they jump around at radically different speeds, can be very confusing. Like with the combat previously mentioned, it happens so fast. I struggle to comprehend how a person is supposed to keep up with the scenarios happening, especially when there's 100 dwarves running around, or well, hopping from one pixel tile to the next. I think Dwarf Fortress could benefit from having a speed adjustment setting, or something, instead of just pause and go. Maybe like pause, quarter speed, half speed, full speed, and double speed. Or at least a fluid camera and fluid movement. I'm sure there's a programming reason why that's not the case. I'm sure it's probably impossible to do after, 20 years of history involved, but I feel like it was worth mentioning. Wrapping up, we'll briefly talk about the mid and late game of Dwarf Fortress. Mid game, in my head, means you have a completely functional base with a few waves of settlers successfully housed, fed, and defended. If you made it to this point, well done. What do you do next? Well, honestly, the creativity of the individual playing really takes control right about now. Browsing the subreddit, I've seen some amazing stories and wonderful creations of people far more patient than I. I look forward to eventually getting myself to the end game. Personally, I'd love to play with the volcanoes, do some raiding, and make a fortress that I'm actually proud of. Despite all my complaining, I believe the open-ended nature of Dwarf Fortress is its greatest strength. No two people play the same, and no playstyle is invalid. One more time, if you're a creative person, I highly recommend this game, as you can feel the inspiration pouring out of you. In conclusion and contradiction, maybe I'm the only person playing the game wrong, or I'm too much of an outsider. But I definitely do have a lot of fun with the game, and I think you will too. Just have Google at the ready, and be prepared to have a couple fortresses fall to the stupidest reasons. After doing your homework, you'll find a game that I truly believe is one of the greatest outlets for creativity in recent memory. I wish all of you luck, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. Thank you.